Good morning. On behalf of Mrs. Baird, our principal, I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to our Remembrance Assembly. We'll begin in a moment with the singing of OCanada. This will be followed by stories, music, and poems. We'll observe a moment of silence and conclude with God Save the King. The students performing in today's assembly have decided to keep their names hidden. We do this to honor the 28,000 unknown Canadian soldiers who died during the 20th century. Lest we forget. Please stand for the singing of O Canada.
Canadians marked the first Remembrance Day on November 11th, 1919. At the time, it was called Armistice Day. Before Armistice Day, countries rarely paused to remember their war dead, and when they did, they remembered the great leaders who had brought victory. The First World War changed how we remembered conflict. That war was a tragedy. Countries wanted to honor the 16 million victims. You might find it interesting to know that it was not a soldier or a politician who taught the world about remembrance. It was an artist, the Canadian sculptor Walter Allward. He was already a respected artist in 1936 when he unveiled his famous Vimy Monument. Vimy Ridge was the site of a famous Canadian battle fought in 1917. Allward placed 20 sculptures around his monument to teach future generations about war and remembrance. This is why the image of Vimy Memorial is on the Canadian $20 bill. The Vimy Monument was a different memorial to the fallen. The base of the memorial was designed to look like a strong fortress. This represented Canadian military strength. The twin columns represent the Canadian and French alliance during the war. Allward wanted to honor the common soldiers who came from the small Canadian towns like Sussex. So he spent 12 years chiseling the 12,285 names of the Canadian soldiers who died defending France. The story of remembrance begins at the base of the twin columns, where a statue is sacrificed on the altar of war and passes the torch of remembrance to a new generation. Their gaze looks up towards the top of the twin columns. At the top of the spires, the Canadian values of peace and justice remind visitors why Canadians fought in the war. Other statues express their generation's desire to break the weapons of war and to live in peace, and it reminds us to care for the civilian victims of war. Other statues honor grieving parents whose children never returned. Finally, Mother Canada, the most famous Canadian statue, grieves for her lost children. She looks down upon the tomb of the unknown soldier.
Historians never ask kids what they've experienced in war, but I think it's about time we started. Just a few years ago, I was invited to Normandy, France, to study the Canadian battlefields of the Second World War. After a week of exploring the old D-Day landing beaches, I received an odd invitation. An elderly farmer wanted to meet me in a cemetery, a Canadian military cemetery, at a place called Bretteville. The farmer's name was Roger. He was 89 years old and walked with the help of some crutches. He welcomed me with a big smile and a strong handshake. And after a few introductions, Roger led me down a long row of headstones. As we shuffled along in the August heat, Roger explained there were over 2,000 Canadians buried at this one cemetery alone. They were all killed near here during the summer of 1944. I noticed he was looking for a particular headstone. When he found it eventually, we paused. It was a soldier from the 1st Hussar Tank Regiment. They were from London, Ontario. The 19-year-old was killed on June 11th, 1944, while driving a Sherman tank, just like the one we have on display here in Sussex. Roger grew silent for a moment. I could tell he had some connection to this particular grave. Without turning his eyes away from the tombstone, Roger began to speak. Not about farming, not about his years as village mayor, but stories from his youth. Stories he'd been carrying for 8 decades. In that moment, I realized that inside this frail man was a strong 13-year-old teenager, a boy who wanted to share his wartime experiences. This morning, I'm going to tell you just a few of the secrets Roger shared with me. And if you listen carefully, you'll hear all the promises enshrined on the Vimy Monument come to life. When Roger was born, he had no idea his little farming village was going to be in the middle of the most famous battlefield in history. Le Mesnil-Patrie was just 20 kilometers from the beaches of Normandy, France. As a young boy, his life revolved around farm chores, school, and the church. His family kept some 20 cows, pigs, some chickens. He attended school in a one-room schoolhouse with 23 other village children, grades 1 to 8. In his free time, Roger liked to bike and play soccer. Roger's idyllic life changed forever with the onset of the Second World War. When Roger was 9, Adolf Hitler's Nazi war machine occupied France in a matter of weeks. The occupation would last 4 seemingly endless years. The Nazis forced many young Frenchmen to work in labor camps. The farmers were forced to turn over half their meat and 20% of their vegetables to feed the Nazi army. If that wasn't stressful enough, Roger's father and his uncles also had to work as slaves for the German army 1 day each week. They were driven to the beaches to build fortifications. Those fortifications were called Hitler's Atlantic Wall and were designed to throw any Allied rescue invasion back into the sea. Today, it's hard to imagine just how depressing and hopeless those dark years of occupation were for young Roger. At night, his family would huddle around a radio they kept hidden from the Nazis. Broadcasts from London promised the French that the Allies were preparing for a major invasion of France. One night, the radio announcer reassured his listeners with one simple sentence: "The Canadians are coming." For those trapped in the Nazi nightmare, that simple promise kept the flame of hope alive for millions across Europe, Roger included. Canadians are a peaceful people, but when our friends are in trouble, the hockey sticks come off the ice. Just after dawn on June 6, 1944, the Germans guarding the beaches close to Roger's house were shocked to see Canadian soldiers coming ashore with guns blazing. The Canadian, British, and American forces had crossed the English Channel at night, riding the tail of a major storm. The Allies, as they were known, attacked an 80-kilometer stretch of beach along the Normandy coast. It was called the D-Day invasion, and historians have called it the most important day of the 20th century. It marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's Nazi war machine and the liberation of Western Europe. The beach bombardment shook Roger out of his bed in the pre-dawn hours. The tremendous sounds of battleship gunfire was unforgettable. Each shell was the size of a car and made a hole as large as a football field. Still in his pajamas, Roger joined his neighbors in the street to watch the bombardment flicker the night sky red and orange. Overhead, large formations of Allied aircraft shook the earth on their way to bomb railroads, bridges, and German fortifications. The promised invasion was finally here. Roger and all the village children were delirious with excitement. With so many Allied soldiers coming ashore, liberation had to be close at hand. The D-Day landing occurred on a Tuesday. By Sunday afternoon, June 11th, a Canadian tank squadron from the 1st Hussars of London, Ontario, was approaching Rogers Village. That afternoon, the Canadians made a very rookie mistake. They rushed their attack planning and didn't send patrols forward to look around. Instead, they sent their tanks forward, believing the Nazis had abandoned the village. It would be a costly mistake. Colonel Kurt Meyer of the German 12th SS Panzers had laid a trap using Rogers Village as bait. To disguise his trap and trick the approaching Canadians, he forced all the villagers to remain as human shields. These Nazi SS soldiers were mostly young teenage boys recruited from the Hitler Youth. They were a fanatical group who idolized Hitler and wanted to win respect and glory in battle. Since D-Day, they had earned a reputation for murdering their prisoners, especially Canadians from Nova Scotia. Roger saw the brave Canadian tankers in action from a trench his father had dug in their garden. First, the clever Germans lured the Canadians into the village. Then, anti-tank guns, hidden in barns and haystacks, opened fire. Caught in a surprise crossfire, the Canadian tanks responded by shooting in every direction. The exchange of gunfire was violent, tearing through the village all around them. Livestock panicked and ran in all directions. The 1st Hussar tanks quickly ran low on ammunition. That's when the Nazis unleashed their fearsome Panther tanks. When the shooting was done, 51 Canadian tanks were destroyed and 116 soldiers were dead. Several wounded prisoners were shot in the fields. For Roger, the hope of liberation had given way to despair. Then, things got even worse. Moments after the battle, the teenage soldiers of the 12th SS found Roger in his backyard. At gunpoint, they ordered his family to pack up and leave. They were given 30 minutes to pack a wagon and get out. Stragglers, they promised, would be shot on the spot. So for the next 3 months, Roger and his parents were refugees, riding an old wooden farm cart pulled by a pony that survived the battle. They moved south, away from the fighting as quickly as they could. They tried to find food and shelter while staying ahead of the largest battle in history. At night, Roger and his family slept in destroyed houses, old cars, and barns. Hunger stalked them at every step. Roger had to beg farmers for milk and bread. Some farmers were happy to help the refugees, but to Roger's great disappointment, others were not. Traveling along dusty back roads on his wagon, Roger had an unwanted front row seat to the war. He watched brave Canadian pilots swooping down low to attack German tanks. It was clear the Canadians were not quitting. They were making enormous sacrifices to free the people of France. By August, the Battle of Normandy had pushed Roger and the Nazis into a place called the Falaise Valley. This was without a doubt the most dangerous place on the planet. The Allies had surrounded a large German army in the valley, and one of the most vicious firefights of the war occurred over a number of days. Roger and his family were trapped among the Germans, caught in the crossfire. They had little choice but to make a run for it. Their starving pony pulled their rickety cart with all its might. Against the odds, they narrowly escaped by following a back road. The journey out of the Falaise Valley was a difficult one. The refugees came close to death on several occasions. Allied fighter planes mistook Roger's wagon for a German supply column several times. On a rainy August night, in the middle of a thunderstorm, Roger and his parents took refuge in the town of Torty-Saint-Baird. The small village sat atop a hill. It was a typical French farm village with some houses and shops huddled around a stone Catholic church. 3 German tanks were hiding among some oak trees, watching the road that led up the hill. The German tankers ignored the cold, wet, ragged refugees who set up their tarps next to the church. Roger had no way of knowing, but he came closest to death on that night. Only the bad weather saved his life. You see, a regiment of Canadian infantry were lurking in the forest at the bottom of the hill. They were sizing up the town for an attack. The German tanks had shot at one of their patrols earlier that afternoon. The Canadians weighed their options carefully. Had the weather been good, they would have stood back and leveled the village with artillery and airstrikes. But the thunderstorms prevented that. Instead, they decided to send a small fighting patrol to sneak up on the German tanks. By this point in the battle for Normandy, the Canadian infantry had become skilled night fighters. They crept up the hill using a ditch for cover. The occasional lightning flash lit up the hilltop village. Once the patrol reached the church graveyard, they moved in on the German tanks. Roger was shivering under a wet blanket by the church when the shooting started. He heard rifle fire, grenade blasts, and then the thunderous responses of the German Tiger tanks. The big gun flashes silhouetted the Gothic church spire in the rain. The shootout lasted about 10 minutes before the Tiger tanks, spooked and likely short of ammunition, withdrew into the stormy night. And just like that, the French village of Torty-Saint-Baird was liberated before midnight. There was no fanfare on the village streets, but 14-year-old Roger had seen it all. The tracer bullets flying in all directions, the brave Canadians who spooked the Tiger tanks in the dark, the 2 soldiers lying mortally wounded near the church, and the medics who feverishly tried to save their lives. For the second time that summer, Roger had seen Canadian soldiers die trying to liberate him. As the Canadian infantry entered the village that night, the refugees emerged from their hiding places. Still somewhat stunned from the attack, they slowly realized that the Canadians had liberated them. As reality set in, they began to hug and weep with joy as the driving rain seemingly cleansed them from 4 harsh years of Nazi occupation. In early September 1944, Roger and his family returned home to find their village destroyed. Only his schoolhouse had survived the battle. Luckily, they found 2 of their cows wandering in a field. The pigs and chickens had all been stolen by the Nazis. Everything would have to be rebuilt. With the harvest ruined, most of the livestock dead, and winter fast approaching, starvation was a real threat. Making matters more difficult, their farm fields were littered with war junk. Roger found destroyed tanks, trucks, and rifles still loaded with ammunition everywhere. There were hundreds of unexploded munitions everywhere as well, making cleanup just not difficult, but deadly. This included landmines buried in the soil where their cows needed to graze. Roger narrowly avoided death when one of his cows accidentally tripped a mine with its chain. On a chilly fall afternoon, a stray dog adopted Roger. The dog followed him each day while he looked for firewood. One afternoon, the dog began barking at a patch of wheat field. Roger ignored the pup at first, but the dog wouldn't stop barking. So Roger carefully walked over to see what the dog had found. He was worried it might be another landmine, but it wasn't. There, in the deep grass, was the body of a dead Canadian soldier. The dog found several more Canadian bodies that day, lying where they had fallen in June. Later, Roger and his father took the bodies to the Canadian Military Cemetery at Bretteville. 8 decades later, as I stood under that hot August sun with Roger, I realized the graves he took me to see were some of the Canadians that he and his dog had found back in 1944. Those Canadian boys had sacrificed their youth so that Roger could live in peace and grow old. He visits their graves every year to thank them. So long ago, on a French hill called Vimy, Canadians made a commitment to uphold justice, liberty, and to help the civilian victims of war. So the next time we welcome families into our community running from war, think about Roger, think about his story, and think about the promises enshrined on the Vimy Monument. That's why we help others on this planet, lest we forget.
Flying Officer John Gillespie McGee was a 19-year-old fighter pilot with the Royal Canadian Air Force when he wrote his poem High Flight. He loved writing poetry in school and was inspired by poets who wrote about the First World War. He wrote the poem High Flight during the late summer of 1941. Flying in a Spitfire, he and 3 friends were patrolling the coast of France when they were attacked by German fighters. McGee was the only pilot to escape the flight. Returning to his airfield in England, he sat down on his cot and wrote a poem inspired by his love of flying and the loss of his friends. He slipped a copy of his poem into a letter to his parents in September 1941. A few months later, John died in a mid-air collision over the skies of England during a training fight. Today, the poem High Flight is the official poem of the Canadian Air Force, as well as air forces and astronauts around the world.
High Flights by John McGee. Oh, I have slipped the surely bounds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunwards I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 1,000 things you have not dreamed of, wheeled and swore and swung. High in the sunlit silence, hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long delirious burning blue, I've topped with windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silence lifting mine I've trod the high untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touch the face of God. Major John McCrae was a Canadian doctor during the First World War. In April 1915, he was serving in the trenches near Ypres, Belgium, in an area called Flanders. There he took care of the wounded soldiers while the battle raged nearby. In a letter, he described the war to his mother.
The general impression in my mind is of a nightmare. We have been in the most bitter of fights for 17 days and 17 nights. None of us have had our clothes off, nor our boots even, except occasionally. In all that time while I was awake, gunfire and rifle fire never ceased for 60 seconds, and behind it all was the constant background of the sights of the dead, the wounded, the maimed, and a terrible anxiety lest the enemy break through the front trench line.
In his spare time, McCrae enjoyed writing poetry. When McCrae's closest friend was killed in the fighting, he was buried in a grave with a simple wooden cross. When McCrae visited the cemetery, he noticed that wild poppies were already beginning to bloom between the crosses. Unable to help his friend or any of the others who had died, John McCrae wrote a poem to give them a voice. Today, this cemetery near Ypres, Belgium, marks the location of John McCrae's field hospital. It was here that he wrote the poem In Flanders Field. The soldiers buried here were lives that McCrae could not save, including 15-year-old Valentine Strutwick, who had lied about his age to enter the war. More than 100 years later, local school children still leave poppies and teddy bears at his gravesite. When McCrae would die of pneumonia while serving in the war, he lived to see his poem grow in popularity. Today, many countries around the world would still use the poppy as the flower of remembrance.
Aux chambres d'honneur, les coquelicots sont parsemés de lot en lot après des croix. Et dans l'espace, les alouettes devenues l'esmelon leur chantent au sifflement des abusières. Nous sommes morts, nous qui soignons la vie encore. À nos parents, à nos amis, c'est nous qui responsons ici, aux chambres d'honneur. À vous, jeunes désabusés, et vous de porter l'oriflamme et de garder au fond de l'âme le goût de vivre en liberté. Acceptez le défi, sinon les coquelicots s'en feront aux chambres d'honneur.
In Flanders fields. In Flanders fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, so bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
A time of remembering. They fought so long ago and so far from here to keep us safe from harm. They boarded ships to sail away from family's home and farm. They braved the mud and cold and wet for days and weeks at a time. They dreamed of warmth and safety as they lay there in the grime. In that very first great war they fought, nearly a tenth of the population went. About 60,000 never came home, the most capable any country sent. They fought in the second war that was longer, but they still answered the call. They sailed the sea in half a dozen ships and gave the task their all. By the time that war had ended, the number of ships had grown, and they policed half the Atlantic, helping bring others safely home.
They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
When it rains, it pours, but you didn't even notice. It ain't raining anymore. It's hard to breathe when all you know is the struggle of staying above the rising water line. Well, the sky is finally opened, the rain and wind stop blowing, but you're stuck out in the same old storm again. You hold tight to your umbrella. Well, darling, I'm just trying to tell ya that there's always been a rainbow hanging over your head. If you could see what I see, you'd be blinded by the colors, yellow, red, orange, and green, and at least a million others. So tie up the boat, take off your coat, and take a look around. 'Cause the sky is finally opened, the rain and wind stop blowing, but you're stuck out in the same old storm again. You hold tight to your umbrella. Well, darling, I'm just trying to tell ya that there's always been a rainbow hanging over your head. Oh, tie up the boat, take off your coat, and take a look around. Everything is alright now, 'cause the sky is finally opened, the rain and wind stop blowing, but you're stuck out in the same